The Secret Doctrine by Elena Petrovna Blavatsky, a facsimile of the original edition of 1888, printed by the Cunningham Press, Alhambra, California. Book 2, Part 1, Anthropogenesis, stanzas translated with commentaries, from the Secret Book of John. Stanza 10 continued, verse 39. The first race on every zone was moon-colored, yellow-white. The second yellow like gold. The third red, the fourth brown, which became black with sin. The first 7 human shoots were all of one complexion in the beginning. The next 7, the subraces, began mixing their colors. Note on which became black with sin. Strictly speaking, it is only from the time of the Atlantean brown and yellow giant races that one ought to speak of man, since it was the 4th race only which was the first completely human species, however much larger in size than we are now. In the work Man by Tuchelas, all that is said of the Atlanteans is quite correct. It is chiefly that race which became black with sin that brought the divine names of the Asuras, the Rakshasas, and the Daityas into disrepute, and passed them on to posterity as the names of fiends. For, as said, the Suras, gods, or Devas, having incarnated in the wise men of Atlantis, the names of Asuras and Rakshasas were given to the Atlanteans, which names, owing to their incessant conflicts with the last remnants of the 3rd race and the sons of Will and Yoga, have led to the later allegories about them in the Puranas. Asura was the generic appellation of all the Atlanteans, who were the enemies of the spiritual heroes of the Aryans, gods, unquote. From Man, page 97, end of note. This verse, 39th, relates exclusively to the racial divisions. Strictly speaking, esoteric philosophy teaches a modified polygenesis, for while it assigns to humanity a oneness of origin, insofar that its forefathers, or, quote, creators, unquote, were all divine beings, though of different classes or degrees of perfection in their hierarchy, men were nevertheless born on 7 different centers of the continent of that period. Though all of one common origin, yet for reasons given in their potentialities and mental capabilities, outward or physical form and future characteristics were very different. Note: some superior, other inferior, to suit the karma of the various reincarnating monads, which could not be all of the same degree of purity in their last births in other worlds. This accounts for the difference of races, the inferiority of the savage and other human varieties. End of note. As to their complexions, there is a suggestive allegory told in Lingua Purana. The Kumara, the Rudra gods, so-called, see further, are described as incarnations of Shiva, the destroyer of outward forms, named also Vamadeva. The latter as a Kumara, the eternal celibate. The chaste virgin youth springs from Brahma in each great Manvantara, and again becomes 4, a reference to the 4 great divisions of the human races as regards complexion and type, and 3 chief variations of these. Thus, in the 29th Kalpa, in this case a reference to the transformation and evolution of the human form, which Shiva ever destroys and remodels periodically, down to the Manvantaric great turning point about the middle of the 4th Atlantean race in the 29th Kalpa, Shiva, as Shvetalohita, the root Kumara, becomes from moon-colored white in his next transformation. He is red, and in this the exoteric version differs from the esoteric teaching, in the 3rd yellow, in the 4th black. Esotericism classes these 7 variations, with their 4 great divisions, into only 3 distinct primeval races, as it does not take into consideration the 1st race, which had neither type nor color, and hardly an objective, though colossal form. The evolution of these races, their formation and development, went pari passu and on parallel lines with the evolution, formation, and development of 3 geological strata, from which the human complexion was as much derived as it was determined by the climates of these zones. It names 3 great divisions, namely the red-yellow, the black, and the brown-white. Note: There are, says Topinard, English edition of Anthropology, with preface by Professor Brocca, 3 fundamental elements of color in the human organism, namely the red, the yellow, and the black, which, mixed in variable quantities with the white of the tissues, give rise to those numerous shades seen in the human family." Unquote. Here is science unintentionally supporting occultism again. End of note. The Aryan races, for instance, now varying from dark brown, almost black, red-brown yellow, down to the whitest creamy color, are yet all of one and the same stock, the 5th root race, and spring from one single progenitor, called in Hindu exotericism by the generic name of Vaivashvatamanu. The latter, remember, being that generic personage, the sage, who is said to have lived over 18 million years ago, and also 850,000 years ago at the time of the sinking of the last remnants of the great continent of Atlantis. See the root and seed Manus further on, and who is said to live even now in his mankind. Note, it must be remembered that the last remnants here spoken of refer to those portions of the great continent which still remained, and not to any of the numerous islands which existed contemporaneously with the continent. Plato's island was, for instance, one of such remnants, the others having sunk at various periods previously. An occult, quote, tradition, unquote, teaches that such submersions occur whenever there is an eclipse of the spiritual sun. End of note. The light yellow is the color of the first solid human race, which appeared after the middle of the 3rd root race, after its fall into generation, as just explained, bringing on the final changes. For it is only at that period that the last transformation took place, which brought forth man, as he is now, only on a magnified scale. This race gave birth to the 4th race, quote, Shiva, unquote, gradually transforming that portion of humanity which became, quote, black with sin, unquote, into red-yellow, the Red Indians and the Mongolians being the descendants of these, and finally into brown-white races, which now, together with the yellow races, form the great bulk of humanity. The allegory in Linga Purana is curious as showing the great ethnological knowledge of the ancients. When reading of the last transformation, let the reader consider at this juncture, if that took place 18 million years ago, how many millions more it must have required to reach that final stage. And if man in his gradual consolidation developed pari passu with the earth, how many millions of years must have elapsed during the first, second, and the first half of the 3rd race? For the earth was in a comparatively ethereal condition before it reached its last consolidated state. The archaic teachings, moreover, telling us that during the middle period of the Lemur-Atlantean race, 3.5 races after the genesis of man, the earth, man, and everything on the globe was of a still grosser and more material nature, while such things as corals and some shells were still in a semi-gelatinous astral state. The cycles that intervened since then have already carried us onward on the opposite ascending arc, some steps toward our dematerialization, as the spiritualists would say. The earth, ourselves, and all things have softened since then, even our brains. But it has been objected by some theosophists that an ethereal earth, even some 15 or 20 million years ago, does not square with geology, which teaches us that winds blew, rains fell, waves broke on the shore, sands shifted and accumulated, etc., etc., that, in short, all natural causes now in operation were then in force, in the very earliest ages of geological time, that of the oldest Paleozoic rocks. To this the following answers are given. Firstly, what is the date assigned by geology to those oldest Paleozoic rocks? And secondly, why could not the winds blow, rain fall, and waves of carbonic acid, apparently as science seems to imply, break on the shore on an earth semi-astral, that is, viscid? The word astral does not necessarily mean as thin as smoke in occult phraseology, but rather starry, shining or pellucid, in various and numerous degrees, from a quite filmy to a viscid state, as just observed. But it is further objected, how could an astral earth have affected the other planets in this system? Would not the whole process get out of gear now if the attraction of one planet was suddenly removed? The objection is evidently invalid, since our system is composed of older and younger planets, some dead like the Moon, others in process of formation, for all astronomy knows to the contrary. Nor has the latter ever affirmed, so far as we know, that all the bodies of our systems have sprung into existence and developed simultaneously. Tis Himalayan secret teachings differ from those of India in this respect. Hindu occultism teaches that the Vaivashvata Manu humanity is 18 million and odd years old. We say yes, but only so far as physical, or approximately physical, man is concerned, who dates from the close of the third root race. Beyond that period, man, on his filmy image, may have existed for 300 million years, for all we know, since we are not taught figures which are and will remain secret with the masters of occult science, as justly stated in esoteric Buddhism. Moreover, whereas the Hindu Puranas speak of one Vaivashvata Manu, we affirm that there were several, the name being a generic one, Vidasupra. We must now say a few more words on the physical evolution of man. Archaic teachings in the Puranas and Genesis, physical evolution. The writer cannot give too much proof that the system of cosmogony and anthropogeny as described actually existed, that its records are preserved, and that it is found mirrored even in the modern versions of ancient scriptures. The Puranas on the one hand, and the Jewish scriptures on the other, are based on the same scheme of evolution which, read esoterically and expressed in modern language, would be found to be quite as scientific as much of what now passes current as the final word of recent discovery. The only difference between the two schemes is that the Puranas, giving as much and perhaps more attention to the causes than to the effects, allude to the pre-cosmic and pre-genetic periods rather than to those of so-called creation, whereas the Bible, saying only a few words on the former period, plunges forthwith into material genesis and, while nearly skipping the pre-Adamic races, proceeds with its allegories concerning the fifth race. Now, whatever the onslaught made on the order of creation in Genesis, and its dead-letter account certainly lends itself admirably to criticism, he who reads the Hindu Puranas, its allegorical exaggerations notwithstanding, will find them quite in accordance with physical science. Note: Mr. Gladstone's unfortunate attempt to reconcile the genetic account with science, see 19th century, Dawn of Creation, and the Proem to Genesis, 1886, has brought upon him the Jovian thunderbolt hurled by Mr. Huxley. The dead-letter account warranted no such attempt, and his fourfold order or division of animated creation has turned into the stone which, instead of killing the fly on the sleeping friend's brow, killed the man instead. Mr. Gladstone killed Genesis forever, but this does not prove that there is no esotericism in the latter. The fact that the Jews and all the Christians, the modern as well as the early sects, have accepted the narrative literally for 2,000 years shows only their ignorance, and shows the great ingenuity and constructive ability of the initiated rabbins who have built the two accounts, the Elohistic and the Jehovistic, esoterically, and have purposely confused the meaning by the vowel-less glyphs or word signs in the original text. The 6 days, Yom, of creation do mean 6 periods of evolution, and the 7th that of culmination of perfection, not of rest, and refer to the 7 rounds and the 7 races with a distinct creation in each, though the use of the words boker, dawn or morning, and krib, evening twilight, which have esoterically the same meaning as sandhya, twilight in Sanskrit, have led to a charge of the most crass ignorance of the order of evolution. End of note. Even what appears to be the, on the face of it, perfectly nonsensical allegory of Brahma assuming the form of a boar to rescue the earth from under the waters finds in the secret commentaries a perfectly scientific explanation, relating as it does to the many risings and sinkings and the constant alteration of water and land from the earliest to the latest geological periods of our globe. For science teaches us now that 9/10 of the stratified formations of the Earth's crust have been gradually constructed beneath water at the bottom of the seas. The ancient Aryans are credited with having known nothing whatever of natural history, geology, and so on. The Jewish race is, on the other hand, proclaimed even by its severest critic an uncompromising opponent of the Bible. See Modern Science and Modern Thought, page 337. To have the merit of having conceived the idea of monotheism earlier and retained it more firmly than any of the less philosophical and more immoral religions, within brackets double exclamation mark, of the ancient world, unquote. Only while we find in biblical esotericism physiological sexual mysteries symbolized, and very little more, something for which very little real philosophy is requisite, in the Puranas one may find the most scientific and philosophical, quote, dawn of creation, unquote, which, if impartially analyzed and rendered into plain language from its fairy tale-like allegories, would show that modern zoology, geology, astronomy, and nearly all the branches of modern knowledge have been anticipated in the ancient science, and were known to the philosophers in their general features, if not in such detail as at present. Puranic astronomy, with all its deliberate concealment and confusion for the purpose of leading the profane off the real track, was shown even by Bentley to be a real science, and those who are versed in the mysteries of Hindu astronomical treatises will prove that the modern theories of the progressive condensation of nebulae, nebulous stars and suns, with the most minute details about the cyclic progress of asterisms, far more correct than Europeans have even now, for chronological and other purposes, were known in India to perfection. If we turn to geology and zoology, we find the same. What are all the myths and endless genealogies of the 7 Prajapati and their sons, the 7 rishis or manus, and of their wives, sons, and progeny, but a vast detailed account of the progressive development and evolution of animal creation, one species after the other? Were the highly philosophical and metaphysical Aryans the authors of the most perfect philosophical systems of transcendental psychology, of codes of ethics, and such a grammar as Panini's, of the Sankhya and Vedanta systems, and a moral code, Buddhism, proclaimed by Max Müller the most perfect on earth, such fools or children as to lose their time in writing fairy tales, such tales as the Puranas now seem to be in the eyes of those who have not the remotest idea of their secret meaning. What is the fable, the genealogy and origin of Kashyapa, with his 12 wives, by whom he had a numerous and diversified progeny of nagas, serpents, reptiles, birds, and all kinds of living things, and who was thus the father of all kinds of animals, but a veiled record of the order of evolution in this round? So far, we do not see that any Orientalist ever had the remotest conception of the truth concealed under the allegories and personifications. The Satapatha Brahmana, says one, gives a not very intelligible account of Kashyapa's origin. He was the son of Mariki, the son of Brahma, the father of Vaivashvat, the father of Manu, the progenitor of mankind, having assumed the form of a tortoise. Prajapati created offspring. That which he created he made Akarot, hence the word Kurma, tortoise. Kashyapa means tortoise. Hence men say all creatures are descendants of Kashyapa, etc., etc., from Hindu Classical Dictionary. He was all this. He was also the father of Garuda, the bird, the king of the feathered tribe, who descends from and is one of the stock with the reptiles, the Nagas, and who becomes their mortal enemy subsequently, as he is also a cycle, a period of time which in the course of evolution the birds which developed from reptiles in their struggle for life, survival of the fittest, etc., etc., turned in preference on those they issued from, to devour them, perhaps prompted by natural law, in order to make room for other and more perfect species. Read Part 2, Symbolism. Once united, the two and then the three made one, for though the lower animals from the amoeba to man received their monads in which all the higher qualities are potential, all have to remain dormant, till each reaches its human form, before which stage manas, mind, has no development in them. Note, men are made complete only during their third toward the fourth cycle race. They are made gods for good and evil, and responsible only when the two arcs meet after 3.5 rounds towards the fifth race. They are made so by the Nirmanakaya, spiritual or astral remains, of the Rudra Kumaras, cursed to be reborn on earth again, meaning doomed in their natural turn to reincarnation in the high ascending arc of the terrestrial cycle. From Commentary 9. End of note. In the animals every principle is paralyzed and in a fetus-like state save the second, vital, and the third, the astral, and the rudiments of the fourth, karma, which is desire, instinct, whose intensity and development varies and changes with the species. To the materialist wedded to the Darwinian theory, this will read like a fairy tale, a mystification. To the believer in the inner spiritual man, the statement will have nothing unnatural in it. Now the writer is certain to meet what will be termed insuperable objections. We shall be told that the line of embryology, the gradual development of every individual life, and the progress of what is known to take place in the order of progressive stages of the specialization, that all this is opposed to the idea of man preceding mammals. Man begins as the humblest and most primitive vermiform creature, from the primitive speck of protoplasm and the nucleated cell in which all life originates, and is developed through stages undistinguishable from those of fish, reptile, and mammal, until the cell finally attains the highly specialized development of the quadrumanous, and last of all, of the human type. Quote from Lang, page 335. This is perfectly scientific, and we have nothing against that, for all this relates to the shell of man, his body, which in its growth is subject, of course, like every other once called morphological unit, to such metamorphoses. It is not those who teach the transformation of the mineral atom through crystallization, which is the same function and bears the same relation to its inorganic so-called upadi, or basis, as to the formation of cells to their organic nuclei through plant, insect, and animal into man. It is not they who will reject this theory, as it will finally lead to the recognition of a universal deity in nature, ever present and ever invisible and unknowable, and of intracosmic gods, who all were men. Note, the whole trouble is this. Neither physiologists nor pathologists will recognize that the cell-germinating substance, the cytoblastema, and the medullae from which crystals originate, are one and the same essence, save in differentiation for purposes. End of note. But we would ask, what does science and its exact and now axiomatic discoveries prove against our occult theory? Those who believe in the law of evolution and gradual progressive development from a cell, which from a vital has become a morphological cell, until it awoke as protoplasm pure and simple, these can surely never limit their belief to one line of evolution. The types of life are innumerable, and the progress of evolution, moreover, does not go at the same rate in every kind of species. The constitutional primordial matter in the Silurian age, we mean primordial matter of science, is the same in every essential particular, save its degree of present grossness, as the primordial living matter of today. Nor do we find that which ought to be found if the now orthodox theory of evolution were quite correct, namely a constant, ever-flowing progress in every species of being. Instead of that, what does one see? While the intermediate groups of animal being all tend toward a higher type, and while specializations, now one type and now of another, develop through the geological ages, change forms, assume new shapes, appear and disappear with a kaleidoscopic rapidity in the description of paleontologists from one period to another. The two solitary exceptions to the general rule are those at the two opposite poles of life and type, namely, man and the lower genera of being. Quote, certain well-marked forms of living beings have existed through enormous epochs, surviving not only the changes of physical conditions, but persisting comparatively unaltered, while other forms of life have appeared and disappeared. Such forms may be termed persistent types of life, and examples of them are abundant enough in both the animal and the vegetable worlds." Unquote. Huxley, Proceedings of Royal Institute, Volume 3, page 151. Nevertheless, we are not giving any good reason why Darwin links together reptiles, birds, amphibians, fishes, mollusca, etc., as offshoots of a moneric ancestry. Nor are we told whether reptiles, for instance, are direct descendants of the amphibia and fishes over lower forms, which they certainly are. For the monads have passed through all these forms of being up to man on every planet in the 3 preceding rounds, every round as well as every subsequent globe from A to G having been and still having to be the arena of the same evolution, only repeated each time on a more solid material basis. Therefore the question, what relation is there between the 3rd round astral prototypes and ordinary physical development in the course of the origination of pre-mammalian organic species, is easily answered. One is the shadowy prototype of the other, the preliminary, hardly defined and evanescent sketch on the canvas of objects which are destined to receive the final and vivid form under the brush of the painter. The fish evolved into an amphibian, a frog, in the shadows of ponds, and a man passed through all his metamorphoses on this globe in the 3rd round as he did in this, his 4th cycle. The 3rd round types contributed to the formation of the types in this one. On strict analogy, the cycle of 7 rounds in their work of the gradual formation of man through every kingdom of nature are repeated on a microscopical scale in the first 7 months of gestation of a future human being. Let the student think over and work out this analogy. As the 7 months old unborn baby, though quite ready, yet needs 2 months more in which to acquire strength and consolidate, so man, having perfected his evolution during 7 rounds, remains 2 periods more in the womb of Mother Nature before he is born, or rather reborn, a Dhyani, still more perfect than he was before he launched forth as a monad on the newly built chain of worlds. Let the student ponder over this mystery, and then he will easily convince himself that, as there are also physical links between many classes, so there are precise domains wherein the astral merges into physical evolution. Of this science breathes not one word. Man has evolved with and from the monkey, it says. But now see the contradiction. Huxley proceeds to point out plants, ferns, club mosses, some of them generically identical with those now living, which are met with in the Carboniferous epoch, for the cone of the Oolitic Araucaria is hardly distinguishable from that of existing species. Sub-kingdoms of animals yield the same instance. The Globigerina of the Atlantic soundings is identical with the Cretaceous species of the same genus. The tabulate corals of the Silurian epoch are wonderfully like the millipores of our own seas. The Arachnida, the highest group of which, the scorpions, is represented by the coal by a genus differing only from its living congeners only in the eyes, etc., all of which may be closed with Dr. Carpenter's authoritative statement about the foraminifera. There is no evidence, he says, of any fundamental modification or advance in the foraminiferous type from the Paleozoic period to the present time. The foraminiferous fauna of our own series probably present a greater range of variety than existed at any previous period, but there is no indication of any tendency to elevation towards a higher type. Page 11 of Introduction to the Study of the Foraminifera. Now, if there is no indication of change in the foraminifera, a protozoon of the lowest type of life, mouthless and eyeless, except its greater variety now than before, man, who is on the uppermost rung of the ladder of being, indicates still less change, as we have seen, the skeleton of his Paleolithic ancestor being even found superior in some respects to his present frame. Where is, then, the claimed uniformity of law, the absolute rule for one species shading off into another, and by insensible gradations into higher types. We see Sir William Thomson admitting as much as 400 million of years in the Earth's history since the surface of the globe became sufficiently cool to permit of the presence of living things. And during that enormous lapse of time in the Oolitic period alone, the so-called Age of Reptiles, we find a most extraordinary variety and abundance of saurian forms, the amphibian type reaching its highest developments. Note: Transformation of Geology, Society of Glasgow, Volume 3. Very strangely, however, he has just changed his opinion. The Sun, he says, is only 15 million old. End of note. We learn of ichthyosauri and plesiosauri in the lakes and rivers, and the winged crocodiles or lizards flying in the air, after which, in the Tertiary period, we find the mammalian type exhibiting remarkable divergencies from previous existing forms. Mastodons, megatheriums, and other unwieldy denizens of the ancient forests and plains, and subsequently are notified of, quote, the gradual modification of one of the ramifications of the quadrumanous order into those beings from which primeval man himself may claim to have been evolved, unquote, from the beginnings of life. He may, but no one except materialists can see why he should, as there is not the slightest necessity for it. Nor is such an evolution warranted by facts, for those most interested in the proofs thereof confess their utter failure to find one single fact to support their theory. There is no need for the numberless types of life to represent the members of one progressive series. They are the products of various and different evolutional divergencies, taking place now in one direction and now in another. Therefore it is far more justifiable to say that the monkey evolved into the quadrumanous order than that primeval man who has remained stationary in his human specialization ever since his fossil is found in the oldest strata, and of whom no variety is found save in color and facial type, has developed from a common ancestor together with the ape. That man originates, like other animals, in a cell and develops through stages undistinguishable from those of fish, reptile, and mammal until the cell attains the highly specialized development of the quadrumanous and at last the human type, is an occult axiom thousands of years old. The Kabbalistic axiom: a stone becomes a plant a beast a man a god, holds good throughout the ages. Haeckel, in his Schöpfungsgeschichte, shows a double drawing representing two embryos, that of a dog 6 weeks old and that of a man 8 weeks. The two, except the slight difference in the head, larger and wider about the brain in the man, are undistinguishable. Quote, in fact, we may say that every human being passes through the stage of fish and reptile before arriving at that of mammal and finally of man. If we take him up at the more advanced stage where the embryo has already passed the reptilian form for a considerable time, the line of development remains the same as that of other mammalia. The rudimentary limbs are exactly similar, the 5 fingers and toes develop in the same way, and the resemblance after the first 4 weeks' growth between the embryo of a man and a dog is such that it is scarcely possible to distinguish them. Even at the age of 8 weeks, the embryo man is an animal with a tail hardly to be distinguished from an embryo puppy. Unquote, from Modern Science, etc., page 171. Why then not make man and dog evolve from a common ancestor, or from a reptile, or naga, instead of coupling man with the quadrumana? This would be just as logical as the other, and more so. The shape and the stages of the human embryo have not changed since historical times, and these metamorphoses were known to Aesculapius and Hippocrates, as well as to Mr. Huxley. Therefore, since the Kabbalists had remarked it since prehistoric times, it is no new discovery. In Isis, Volume 1, page 389, it is noticed and half explained. As the embryo of a man has no more of the ape in it than of any other mammal, but contains in itself the totality of the kingdoms of nature, and since it seems to be a persistent type of life, far more so than even the foraminifera, It seems as illogical to make him evolve from the ape as it would be to trace his origin to the frog or the dog. Both occult and Eastern philosophies believe in evolution, which Manu and Kapila give with far more clearness than any other scientist does at present. No need to repeat that which was fully debated in Isis Unveiled, as the reader may find all these arguments and the description of the basis on which all the Eastern doctrines of evolution rested in our earlier books. But no occultist can accept the unreasonable proposition that all the now existing forms, from the structureless amoeba to man, are the direct lineal descendants of organisms which lived millions and millions of years before the birth of man, in the pre-Silurian epochs, in the sea or land mud. Notes. Note on both occult and Eastern philosophies believe in evolution. Hence the philosophy in the allegory of the 7th, 10th, and finally 21st Prajapati, Rishis, Munis, etc., who were all made the fathers of various things and beings. The order of the 7 classes or orders of plants, animals, and even inanimate things, given at random in the Puranas, is found in several commentaries in the correct rotation. Thus, Prithu is the father of the earth. He milks her, and makes her bear every kind of grain and vegetable, all enumerated and specified. Kashyapa is the father of all the reptiles, snakes, demons, etc., etc. And note on Isis Unveiled. See Volume 1, page 151 et sequens, about the tree of evolution, the mundane tree. End of notes. The occultists believe in an inherent law of progressive development. Note. Checked and modified, however, by the law of retardation, which imposes a restriction on the advance of all species when a high type makes its appearance. End of note. Mr. Darwin never did, and says so himself. On page 145 of The Origin of Species, we find him stating that since there can be no advantage to the infusorian animalcule or an intestinal worm to become highly organized, therefore natural selection, not including necessarily progressive development, leaves the animalcule and the worm, the persistent types, quiet. There does not appear much uniform law in such behavior of nature, and it looks more like the discriminative action of some supernatural selection, perhaps that aspect of karma which Eastern occultists would call the law of retardation may have something to do with it. But there is every reason to doubt whether Mr. Darwin himself ever gave such an importance to his law as is given to it now by his atheistic followers. The knowledge of the various living forms in geological periods that have gone by is very meager. The reasons given for this by Dr. Bastian are very suggestive. 1. On account of the imperfect manner in which the several forms may be represented in the strata pertaining to the period. 2. On account of the extremely limited nature of the explorations which have been made in these imperfectly representative strata. And 3. Because so many parts of the records are absolutely inaccessible to us. Nearly all beneath the Silurian system have been blotted out by time, whilst those 2/3 of the Earth's surface in which the remaining strata are to be found are now covered over by seas." Unquote. Hence Mr. Darwin says himself, quote, "For my part, following out Lyell's metaphor, I look at the geological record as a history of the world imperfectly kept and written in a changing dialect. Out of this history we possess the last volume alone, relating only to 2 or 3 countries. Of this volume, only here and there a short chapter has been preserved, and of each page only here and there a few lines. It is not on such meagre data, certainly, that the last word of science can be said, nor is it on any ground of human pride unreasonable belief in man's representing even here on earth, in our period perhaps, the highest type of life that occultism denies that all the preceding forms of human life belonged to types lower than our own, for it is not so, but simply because the, quote, missing link, unquote, such as to prove the existing theory undeniably, will never be found by paleontologists. Believing, as we do, that man has evolved from and passed through during the preceding rounds the lowest forms of every life, vegetable and animal, on earth, There is nothing very degrading in the idea of having the orangutan as an ancestor of our physical form. Quite the reverse, as it would forward the occult doctrine with regard to the final evolution of everything in terrestrial nature into man most irresistibly. One may even inquire how it is that biologists and anthropologists, having once firmly accepted the theory of the descent of man from the ape, how it is that they have hitherto left untouched the future evolution of the existing apes into man. This is only a logical sequence of the first theory, unless science would make of man a privileged being, and his evolution a non-precedent in nature, quite a special and unique case. And that is what all this leads physical science to. The reason, however, why the occultists reject the Darwinian and especially the Haeckel'ian hypothesis is because it is the ape which is, in sober truth, a special and unique instance, not man. The pithecoid is an accidental creation, a forced growth, the result of an unnatural process. The occult doctrine is, we think, more logical. It teaches a cyclic, never-varying law in nature, the latter having no personal special design, but acting on a uniform plan that prevails through the whole Manvantaric period, and deals with the landworm as it deals with man. Neither the one nor the other have sought to come into being, hence both are under the same evolutionary law, and both have to progress according to karmic law. Both have started from the same neutral center of life, and both have to re-merge into it at the consummation of the cycle. It is not denied that in the preceding round man was a gigantic ape-like creature, and when we say man, we ought perhaps to say the rough mold that was developing for use of man in this round only, the middle or the transition point of which we have hardly reached. Nor was man what he is now during the first 2.5 root races. That point he reached, as said before, only 18 million years ago, during the secondary period, as we claim. Till then he was, according to tradition and occult teaching, a god on earth who had fallen into matter, or generation. This may or may not be accepted, since the secret doctrine does not impose itself as an infallible dogma, and since, whether its prehistoric records are accepted or rejected, it has nothing to do with the question of the actual man and his inner nature, the fall mentioned above having left no original sin on humanity. But all this has been sufficiently dealt with. Furthermore, we are taught that the transformations through which man passed on the descending arc, which is centrifugal for spirit and centripetal for matter, and those he prepares to go through henceforward on his ascending path, which will reverse the direction of the two forces, meaning matter will become centrifugal and spirit centripetal, that all such transformations are next in store for the anthropoid ape also, all those at any rate who have reached the remove next to man in this round, and these will all be men in the 4th round, as present men inhabited ape-like forms in the 3rd, the preceding round. Behold them in the modern denizens of the great forest of Sumatra, the degraded and dwarfed examples, blurred copies, as Mr. Huxley has it, of ourselves as we, the majority of mankind, were in the earliest sub-races of the 4th root race during the period of what is called the fall into generation. The ape we know is not the product of natural evolution, but an accident, a crossbreed between an animal being or form and man. As has been shown in the present volume, Anthropogenesis, it is the speechless animal that first started sexual connection, having been the first to separate into males and females. Nor was it intended by nature that man should follow the bestial example, as shown by the comparatively painless procreation of their species by the animals, and the terrible suffering and danger of the same in the woman. The ape is, indeed, as remarked in Isis Unveiled, Volume 2, page 278, a transformation of species most directly connected with that of the human family, a hybrid branch engrafted on their own stock before the final perfection of the latter, or man. The apes are millions of years later than the speaking human being, and are the latest contemporaries of our 5th race. Thus it is most important to remember that the egos of the apes are entities compelled by their karma to incarnate in the animal forms, which resulted from the bestiality of the latest third and the earliest fourth race men. They are entities who had already reached the human stage before this round. Consequently, they form an exception to the general rule. The numberless traditions about satyrs are no fables, but represent an extinct race of animal men. The animal, quote, Eves, unquote, were their foremothers, and the human, quote, Adams, unquote, their forefathers. Hence the Kabbalistic allegory of Lilith, or Lilatu, Adam's first wife, whom the Talmud describes as a charming woman with long wavy hair. That is, a female hairy animal of a character now unknown, still a female animal, who in the Kabbalistic and Talmudic allegories is called the female reflection of Samuel Lilith, or man-animal united, a being called Hayobishkat, the beast or evil beast, Zohar. It is from this unnatural union that the present apes descended. The latter are truly speechless men and will become speaking animals, or men of a lower order, in the fifth round, while the adepts of a certain school hope that some of the egos of the apes of a high intelligence will reappear at the close of the sixth root race. What their form will be is of secondary consideration. The form means nothing. Species and genera of the flora, fauna, and the highest animal, its crown, man, change and vary according to the environments and climatic variations, not only with every round, but every root race likewise, as well as after every geological cataclysm that puts an end to or produces a turning point in the latter. In the sixth root race, the fossils of the orang, the gorilla, and the chimpanzee will be those of extinct quadrumanous mammals, and new forms, though fewer and ever wider apart as ages pass on and the close of the Manvantara approaches, will develop from the cast-off types of the human races as they revert once again to astral, out of the maya or physical life. There were none before man, and they will be extinct before the seventh race develops. Karma will lead on the monads of the unprogressed men of our race and lodge them in the newly evolved human frames of the thus physiologically regenerated baboon. But see Part 3, Addenda. This will take place, of course, millions of years hence, but the picture of this cyclic precession of all that lives and breathes now on earth of each species in its turn is a true one, and needs no special creation or miraculous formation of man, beast, and plant ex nihilo. This is how occult science explains the absence of any link between ape and man, and shows the former evolving from the latter. A panoramic view of the early races. There is a period of a few millions of years to cover between the first, quote, mindless, unquote, race and the highly intelligent and intellectual later Lemurians. There is another between the earliest civilization of the Atlanteans and the historic period. As witnesses to the Lemurian, but a few silent records in the shape of half a dozen broken colossi and old Cyclopean runes are left. These are not allowed a hearing, as they are the productions of blind natural forces, we are assured by some. Quite modern, we are told by others. Tradition is left contemptuously unnoticed by skeptic and materialist, and made subservient to the Bible in every case by the too zealous churchmen. Whenever a legend, however, refuses to fit in with the Noachian deluge theory, it is declared by the Christian clergy the insanely delirious voice of old superstition. Atlantis is denied, when not confused with Lemuria and other departed continents, because perhaps Lemuria is half the creation of modern science, and has therefore to be believed in, while Plato's Atlantis is regarded by most of the scientists as a dream. Atlantis is often described by believers in Plato as a prolongation of Africa. An old continent is also suspected to have existed on the eastern coast. Only Africa as a continent was never part and parcel of either Lemuria or Atlantis, as we have agreed to call the third and fourth continents. Their archaic appellations are never mentioned in the Puranas, nor anywhere else. But with simply one of the esoteric keys in hand, it becomes an easy task to identify these departed lands in the numberless lands of the gods, devas and munis described in the Puranas in the Varshas, Dvipas and zones. There's Sweta Dvipa, during the early day of Lemuria, stood out like a giant peak from the bottom of the sea, the area between Atlas and Madagascar being occupied by the waters till about the early period of Atlantis, after the disappearance of Lemuria, when Africa emerged from the bottom of the ocean and Atlas was half sunk. It is of course impossible to attempt, within the compass of even several volumes, a consecutive and detailed account of the evolution and progress of the first three races, except so far as to give a general view of it, as will be done presently. Race the first had no history of its own. Of race the second the same may be said. We shall have therefore to pay careful attention only to the Lemurians and the Atlanteans, before the history of our own race, the fifth, can be attempted. What is known of other continents besides our own, and what does history know or accept of the early races? Everything outside the repulsive speculations of materialistic science is daubed with the contemptuous term superstition. The wise men of today will believe nothing. Plato's winged and hermaphrodite races and his golden age under the reign of Saturn and the gods are quietly brought back by Haeckel to their new place in nature. Our divine races are shown to be the descendants of catarrhine apes, and our ancestor a piece of sea slime. Nevertheless, as expressed by Faber, the fictions of ancient poetry will be found to comprehend some portion of historical truth. However one-sided the efforts of the learned author of the Mysteries of the Kabiri, efforts directed throughout his 2 volumes to constrain the classical myths and symbols of old paganism, to bear testimony to the truth of Scripture, time and further research have avenged, partially at least, that, quote, truth, unquote, by showing it unveiled. Thus it is the clever adaptations of Scripture, on the contrary, which are made to bear evidence to the great wisdom of archaic paganism. This notwithstanding the inextricable confusion into which the truth about the Kabiri, the most mysterious gods of antiquity, was thrown by the wild and contradictory speculations of Bishop Cumberland, Dr. Shuckford, Cudworth, Valancy, etc., etc., and finally by Faber. Nevertheless, all, from first to last, of these scholars had to come to a certain conclusion framed by the latter. We have no reason to think, he writes, that the idolatry of the Gentile world was of a merely arbitrary contrivance. On the contrary, it seems to have been built, almost universally, upon a traditional remembrance of certain real events. These events I apprehend to be the destruction of the first, and the fourth, in esoteric teachings, race of mankind by the waters of the deluge. Chapter 1, page 9. To this, Faber adds, quote, I am persuaded that the tradition of the sinking of the Phlegian Isle is the very same as that of the sinking of the island Atlantis. They both appear to me to allude to one great event, the sinking of the whole world beneath the waters of the deluge, or, if we suppose the arc of the earth to have remained in its original position, the rising of the central water above it. M. Bailly, indeed, in his work upon the Atlantis of Plato, the object of which is evidently to deprecate the authority of scriptural chronology, labors to prove that the Atlanteans were a very ancient northern nation, long prior to the Hindus, the Phoenicians, and the Egyptians. Unquote, from a dissertation on the Kabiri, page 284. In this Faber is in agreement with Bailly, who shows himself more learned and intuitional than those who accept biblical chronology. Nor is the latter wrong when saying that the Atlanteans were the same as the Titans and the Giants. See Lettres sur l'Atlantide. Faber adopts the more willingly the opinion of his French confrère, as Bailly mentions Cosmas Indicopleustes, who preserved an ancient tradition about Noah, that he formerly inhabited the island Atlantis, from the same source. This island, whether it was the Poseidonis mentioned in esoteric Buddhism or the continent of Atlantis, does not much matter. The tradition is there recorded by a Christian. No occultist would ever think of dispossessing Noah of his prerogatives if he is claimed to be an Atlantean, for this would simply show that the Israelites repeated the story of Vaivarshvatamanu, Xisustrus, and so many others, and that they only changed the name, to do which they had the same right as any other nation or tribe. What we object to is the literal acceptation of biblical chronology, as it is absurd, and in accord with neither geological data nor reason. Moreover, if Noah was an Atlantean, then he was a Titan, a giant, as Faber shows, and if a giant, then why is he not shown as such in Genesis? Note: this is shown by Faber, again a pious Christian, who says that, quote, the Noetic family also bore the appellations of Atlanteans and Titans, and the great patriarch himself was called by way of eminence Atlas and Titan, unquote, volume 2, page 285. And if so, then according to the Bible, Noah must have been the progeny of the sons of God, the fallen angels, agreeably to the same authority, and of the daughters of men who were fair. See Genesis chapter 6. And why not, since his father Lamech slew a man and was, with all his sons and daughters, who perished in the deluge, as bad as the rest of mankind? End of note. Bailly's mistake was to reject the submersion of Atlantis and to call the Atlanteans simply a northern and post-diluvian nation, which, however, as he says, certainly flourished before the foundation of the Hindu, the Egyptian, and the Phoenician empires. In this, had he only known of the existence of what we have agreed to call Lemuria, he would have again been right. For the Atlanteans were post-diluvian to the Lemurians, and Lemuria was not submerged as Atlantis was, but was sunk under the waves owing to earthquakes and subterranean fires, as Great Britain and Europe will be one day. It is the ignorance of our men of science who will accept neither the tradition that several continents have already sunk, nor the periodical law which acts throughout the manvantaric cycle. It is this ignorance that is the chief cause of all the confusion. Nor is Bailly wrong again in assuring us that the Hindus, Egyptians, and Phoenicians came after the Atlanteans, for the latter belong to the fourth, while the Aryans and their Semitic branch are of the fifth race. Plato, while repeating the story as narrated to Solon by the priests of Egypt, intentionally confuses, as every initiate would, the two continents, and assigns to the small island which sunk last all the events pertaining to the two enormous continents, the prehistoric and traditional. Therefore he describes the first couple, from whom the whole island was peopled, as being formed of the earth. In saying so, he means neither Adam and Eve, nor yet his own Hellenic forefathers. His language is simply allegorical, and by alluding to earth he means matter, as the Atlanteans were really the first purely human and terrestrial race, those that preceded it being more divine and ethereal than human and solid. Yet Plato must have known, as would any other initiated adept, about the history of the third race after its fall, though as one pledged to silence and secrecy, he never showed his knowledge in so many words. Nevertheless, it may become easier now after acquainting oneself with even the approximate chronology of the Eastern nations, all of which was based upon and followed the early Aryan calculations, to realize the immense periods of time that must have elapsed since the separation of the sexes, without mentioning the first or even the second root races. As these must remain beyond the comprehension of minds trained in Western thought, it is found useless to speak in detail of the first and second, and even of the third race in its earliest stage. Note, in that wonderful volume of O'Donnell's, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, the author, speaking of the Aryan colonies from Atlantis and of the arts and sciences, the legacy of our fourth race, bravely announces that the roots of the institutions of today reach back to the Miocene age. This is an enormous allowance for a modern scholar to make, but civilization dates still further back than the Miocene Atlanteans. Secondary period man will be discovered, and with him his long-forgotten civilization. End of note. One has to begin with the latter, when it reached its full human period, lest the uninitiated reader should find himself hopelessly bewildered. The third race fell, and created no longer. It begat its progeny. Being still mindless at the period of separation, it begot, moreover, anomalous offspring, until its physiological nature had adjusted its instincts in the right direction. Like the gods of the Bible, the sons of wisdom, the Jiankochans had warned them to leave alone the fruit forbidden by nature, but the warning proved of no value. Men realized the unfitness, we must not say sin, of what they had done, only when too late. After the angelic monads from high spheres had incarnated in and endowed them with understanding. To that day they had remained simply physical, like the animals generated from them. For what is the distinction? The doctrine teaches that the only difference between animate and inanimate objects on earth, between an animal and a human frame, is that in some of the various fires are latent, and in others they are active. The vital fires are in all things, and not an atom is devoid of them. But no animal has the three higher principles awakened in him. They are simply potential, latent, and thus non-existing. And so would the animal frames of men be to this day, had they been left as they came out from the bodies of their progenitors, whose shadows they were, to grow unfolded only by the powers and forces immanent in matter. But as said in Pimander, quote, "This is a mystery that to this day was sealed and hidden. Nature, being mingled with man, brought forth a wondrous miracle, the harmonious commingling of the essence of the seven, Petries, governors, and her own. The fire and the spirit and nature, the noumenon of matter, which, commingling, forthwith brought forth seven men of opposite sexes, negative and positive, according to the essences of the seven governors." Unquote, from Divine Pimander, chapter 1, section 16. Notes on nature being mingled with man. Nature is the natural body, the shadow of the progenitors, and man is the heavenly man, as already stated. Thus saith Hermes, the thrice great initiate, the power of the thought divine. Note on the thrice great initiate. The Pimander of our museums and libraries is an abridgment of one of the books of thought, by a Platonist of Alexandria. In the 3rd century it was remodeled after Old Hebrew and Phoenician manuscripts by a Jewish Kabbalist and called the Genesis of Enoch. But even its disfigured remnants show how closely its text agrees with the archaic doctrine as is shown in the creation of the 7 creators and 7 primitive men. As to Enoch, Tot or Hermes, Orpheus and Cadmus, these are all generic names, branches and offshoots of the 7 primordial sages, incarnated Jiankochans or Devas, in elusive, not mortal bodies, who taught humanity all it knew, and whose earliest disciples assumed their masters' names. This custom passed from the 4th to the 5th race, hence the sameness of the traditions about Hermes, of whom Egyptologists count 5. Enoch, etc. They are all inventors of letters. None of them dies but still lives, and they are the first initiators also, and founders of the mysteries. The Genesis of Enoch disappeared only very lately among the Kabbalists. Guillaume Postel saw it. It was most certainly in a great measure a transcript from the books of Hermes, and far anterior to the books of Moses, as Eliphas Levi tells his readers. End of note. St. Paul, another initiate, called our world the enigmatical mirror of pure truth, and St. Gregory of Stanza10 corroborated Hermes by saying that things visible are but the shadow and delineation of things that we cannot see. It is an eternal combination, and images are repeated from the high rung of the ladder of being down to the lower. The fall of the angels and the war in heaven are repeated on every plane, the lower mirror disfiguring the image of the superior mirror, and each repeating it in its own way. Thus the Christian dogmas are but the reminiscences of the paradigms of Plato, who spoke of these things cautiously, as every initiate would. But it is all expressed in these few sentences of the De Satir. Quote, "All that is on earth, saith the Lord, Ormazd, is the shadow of something that is in the superior spheres. This luminous object, light, fire, etc., is the shadow of that which is still more luminous than itself, and so on till it reaches me, who am the light of lights." Unquote. In the Kabbalistic books, and in the Zohar preeminently, the idea that everything objective on earth or in this universe is the shadow, Diokna, of the eternal light or deity is very strong. The third race was preeminently the bright shadow, at first, of the gods, whom tradition exiles on earth after the allegorical war in heaven, which became still more allegorical on earth, for it was the war between spirit and matter. This war will last till the inner and divine man adjusts his outer terrestrial self to his own spiritual nature. Till then the dark and fierce passions of the former will be at eternal feud with his master, the divine man. But the animal will be tamed one day, because its nature will be changed, and harmony will reign once more between the two as before the fall, when even mortal man was created by the elements and was not born. The above is made clear in all the great theogonies, principally in the Grecian, Hesiod and Theogony. The mutilation of Uranus by his son Kronos, who thus condemns him to impotency, has never been understood by the modern mythographers. Yet it is very plain, and having been universal, it must have contained a great abstract and philosophical idea, now lost to our modern sages. Note: Uranus is a modified Varuna, the universal encompasser, the all-embracer, and one of the oldest of the Vedic deities. Space, the maker of heaven and earth, since both are manifested out of his, or its, seed. It is only later that Varuna became the chief of the Adityas and a kind of Neptune riding the Leviathan, Makara, now the most sacred and mysterious of the signs of the zodiac. Varuna, without whom no creature can even wink, was degraded like Uranus, and, like him, he fell into generation, his functions, the grandest cosmical functions, as Muir calls them, having been lowered down from heaven to earth by exoteric anthropomorphism. As the same Orientalist says, quote, "The attributes ascribed to Varuna in the Vedas impart to his character a moral elevation and sanctity far surpassing that attributed to any other Vedic deity." Unquote. But to understand correctly the reason of his fall, like that of Uranus, one has to see in every exoteric religion the imperfect and sinful work of man's fancy, and also to study the mysteries which Varuna is said to have imparted to Vashishta. Only, quote, "his secrets and those of Mitra are not to be revealed to the foolish." Unquote. End of note. This punishment in the allegory marks indeed a new period, a second phase in the development of creation, as justly remarked by Descartes, Mythologie de la Grecque Antique, page 7, who, however, renounces the attempt to explain it. Uranus has tried to oppose an impediment to that development, or natural evolution, by destroying all his children as soon as born. Uranus, who personifies all the creative powers of an in chaos, space, or the unmanifested deity, is thus made to pay for the penalty, for it is those powers which cause the Pitris to evolve primordial men from themselves, as later on these men evolve their progeny, without any sense or desire for procreation. The work of generation, suspended during a moment, passes into the hands of Kronos, time, who unites himself with Rhea, the earth in esotericism, matter in general, and thus produces after celestial, terrestrial titans. The whole of this symbolism relates to the mysteries of evolution. Note: Kronos is not only chronos, time, but also, as Breal showed in his Hercule de Cacus, on page 57, comes from the root kar, to make, to create. Whether Breal and Descartes, who quotes him, are as right in saying that in the Vedas Kurnan is a creative god, we have our doubts. Breal probably meant karma, or rather Vishvakarma, the creative God, the omniscient and the great architect of the world. End of note. The whole of this symbolism relates to the mysteries of evolution. This allegory is the exoteric version of the esoteric doctrine given in this part of our work. For in Kronos we see the same story repeated again. As Uranus destroyed his children from Gaia, one in the world of manifestation with Aditi, or the great cosmic deep, by confining them in the bosom of the earth, Titya, so Kronos at this second stage of creation destroyed his children from Rhea by devouring them. This is an allusion to the fruitless efforts of earth or nature alone to create real human men. See our stanzas 3 to 10 et sequens, and also Berosus' account of primeval creation. Time swallows its own fruitless work. Then comes Zeus, Jupiter, who dethrones his father in his turn. Note: the titanic struggle, in theogony at least, is the fight for supremacy between the children of Uranus and Gaia, or heaven and earth in their abstract sense. The Titans against the children of Kronos, whose chief is Zeus. It is the everlasting struggle going on to this day between the spiritual inner man and the man of flesh, in one sense. End of note. Jupiter the Titan is Prometheus, in one sense, and varies from Zeus, the great father of the gods. Note: just as the Lord God, or Jehovah, is Cain esoterically, and the tempting serpent as well, the male portion of the androgynous Eve before her fall, the female portion of Adam Kadmon, the left side of Bina of the right side Kokma in the first Sephirothal triad. End of note. He is the disrespectful son in Hesiod. Hermes calls him the heavenly man, Pimander, and even in the Bible he is found again under the name of Adam, and later on, by transmutation, under that of Ham. Yet these are all personifications of the sons of wisdom. The necessary corroboration that Jupiter belongs to the purely human Atlantean cycle, if Uranus and Kronos, who precede him, are found insufficient, may be found in Hesiod, who tells us that the immortals have made men and created the golden and the silver age, first and second races, while Jupiter created the generations of bronze, an admixture of the two elements, of heroes, and the men of the age of iron. After this he sends his fatal present by Pandora to Epimetheus, which present Hesiod calls a fatal gift, or the first woman. Note: in the Egyptian legend, translated by M. Maspero, the ex-director of the Bulak Museum called the two brothers the original of Pandora is given. Noom, the famous heavenly artist, creates a marvelous beauty, a girl which he sends to Batu, after which the happiness of the latter is destroyed. Batu is man, and the girl Eve, of course. See Maspero's Egyptian legends, and also Descamps' Mythologie de la Grèce antique. End of note. It was a punishment, he explains, sent to man for the theft of divine creative fire. Her apparition on earth is the signal of every kind of evil. Before her appearance, the human races lived happy, exempt from sickness and suffering, as the same races are made to live under Yima's rule in the Majdian Vendidad. Two deluges may also be traced in universal tradition by carefully comparing Hesiod, the Rig Veda, the Zendavest, etc., while no first man is ever mentioned in any of the theogonies save the Bible. Note: Yima is not the first man in the Vendidad, but only the theories of the Orientalists. See further on. End of note. Everywhere the man of our race appears after a cataclysm of water, after which tradition mentions only the several designations of continents and islands which sink under the ocean waves in due time. Note: Boeotia, then ancient Athens, and Eleusis were submerged. End of note. Gods and mortals have one common origin, says Hesiod. See the same source, verse 1, c8. And Pindar echoes the statement in Nemesis 6, verse 1. Deucalion and Pyrrha, who escaped the deluge by constructing an ark like Noah's, asked Jupiter to reanimate the human race whom he had made to perish under the waters of the flood. In the Slavonian mythology, Lithuanian legend in Grimm, Deutsche Mythologie, Volume 1, page 545, all men were drowned, and 2 old people, a man and his wife, alone remained. Then Pramgimas, the master of all, advised them to jump 7 times on the rocks of the earth, and 7 new races, couples, were born, from which came the 9 Lithuanian tribes. As well understood by the author of the Mythologie de la Grèce Antique, the 4 ages signify periods of time and are also an allegorical allusion to the races. The successive races, destroyed and replaced by others, he says, without any period of transition, are characterized in Greece by the name of metals to express their ever-decreasing value. Gold, the most brilliant and precious of all, symbol of purity, qualifies the first race. The men of the second race, those of the age of silver, are already inferior to the first. Inert and weak creatures, all their life is no better than a long and stupid infancy. They disappear. The men of the age of bronze are robust and violent, the third race. Their strength is extreme. They had arms made of bronze, habitations of bronze, used naught but bronze. Iron, the black metal, was yet unknown. The 4th generation race is, with Hesiod, that of the heroes who fell before Thebes. See the 7 against Thebes by Aeschylus, or Under the Walls of Troy. Thus the 4 races being found mentioned by the oldest Greek poets, though very much confused anachronistically, our doctrines are once more corroborated by the classics. But this is all mythology and poetry. What can modern science have to say to such an numerization of old fiction? The verdict is not difficult to foresee. Therefore, an attempt must be made to answer by anticipation and prove that fictions and empirical speculations are so much of the domain of that same science that none of the men of learning have the slightest right, with such a heavy beam in their own eye, to point to the speck in the eye of the occultist, even if that speck be not a figment of our opponent's imagination. Next section is stanza 10, continued with verse 40.